Today we continue our journey through the book of Matthew. We're going to pick up where we left off last time with the Magi. They had just visited and bowed down to Jesus in Bethlehem. And you'll remember that they were in the house and God gave them this dream to return another way. Except now we're going to have Joseph also receiving a dream. And he is going to, we looked at this verse, but in Matthew 2, verse 13, it says, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt. So we looked at that a little bit more last time. It's pretty simple language. It's following the example of Joseph in the Old Testament. Remember, Joseph is brought into Egypt. So also this Joseph is going into Egypt with Jesus. And so Jesus's life is going to parallel the entire Old Testament. And of course, this gives us a good example. What does a good Christian father look like? Well, it's somebody who obeys God, who puts his will into practice. It follows his direction. And where are you going to find God's direction? Well, I suppose you could sit around waiting for angels, but maybe better yet, open up your Bible, read it, and put it into practice. So that's Joseph. So then verse 15, and again, we looked at this briefly last time, where he stayed. So this is Joseph, stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. Out of Egypt, I called my son. And so just as the people of Israel were brought up out of Egypt, he called the son out of Egypt. So he called Jesus out of Egypt. And I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but all of Israel, what is Israel called? The children of God. Right? You've heard that expression before. Father Abraham had many sons. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Well, God's children can be summed up in one person. So sometimes the Old Testament calls all of the family, or Israel, the Son of God. Well, Jesus is also a summation or representative of all Israel, and so he's going to be called out of Egypt as well. So now as we get into our text for today, I want to just read it through, and then we'll back up and talk about this a little bit closer. We want to talk about Herod a bit today, and then life in Nazareth. And I guess we could have went into life in Egypt. What would it be like to live in Egypt with all the gods and so forth? Okay, so verse 16. Actually, do we have volunteer? I'm doing all the reading. Would you like to read, Dolores?
I can read that part.
Okay.
I read. When Herod, maybe I will, realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity, who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled.
Okay. Shelley, you up for reading, or
No,
Howard, you want to read that next one?
Okay.
Matthew 2, 18.
A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more.
Okay, and then we'll go on to the next one. Diane?
Matthew 2 verse 19. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead.
Okay.
Chapter 19.
Yep. No, 2:19.
Chapter 2 verse 19.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay, and Carol, do you want to do the last one there? Verse 21.
So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that
Archelaus.
Archelaus was reigning in Judah in place of his father Herod. He was afraid to go there.
Okay. And then having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. And remember, I think last week we talked extensively about that verse. He would be called a Nazarene, and no one can find that Bible passage unless you know that the word Nazar means branch. And then you realize in Isaiah 11, verse 1, it says that the out of the stump of Jesse would come the Nazar. Remember, the Nazar is going to come out of the stump of Jesse. Remember, David's family is going to get cut down, and David's father, Jesse, is going to come this shoot, this branch. And who is the branch? It's Jesus. So he is the Nazar. And it just so happens he lives in Nazareth, which comes from the same name. So we'll come back to Nazareth. So what I want to do now is look at this guy, Herod. And you've all heard lots of things about Herod. And the most famous of the Herods is the first one, Herod the Great. And I brought along a book here that talks a lot about good old Herod. And depending on who you talk to, this is Herod's family tree, by the way.
Why did they kill all the boys?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
My guess is he did kill some of the girls too, because this is Herod. So Herod is just a little bit about him. He's kind of half Jewish, half Gentile. You might even call him more or less a Samaritan, a half-breed. So they didn't like him because he was intermarried, and you weren't supposed to intermarry. So Herod the Great is pretty famous. He was famous for building giant road projects, fortresses. Herod's fortress in Masada, and I believe he built a huge palace. In fact, some of these projects are still there to this day. They might just look like a huge mountain, but he actually moved all the dirt and stone, and just massive building. He was something. In fact, let me see if I can dig this out. I brought along there's a lot been written on Herod. I just dug up. Let me hit stop here so that you can see what I'm up to. But there's just a stack of papers about Herod. Let me just read you a little bit about him. So Herod the Great was the Roman Jewish client king of Judea. And you probably heard that. In other words, Caesar Augustus is over the whole area. He's the dictator, but Herod's in control of this region. So he built his probably most famous building project that you heard of is the temple. Remember the second temple? It was built, but remember they were always complaining about how small it was? Well, Herod made it into one of the 7 wonders of the world at that time. He made it huge. And so the historians write about it, that it shone. I mean, when you were way far away, they put gold right on the front so it would be reflective. So he did all sorts of just crazy projects. He had a lot of problem with marriages. I guess I should mention that. This little list, if I'm counting correctly, he's got Doris, Miriam, let's see, who else is there? Miriam II, Nell Thrace, Cleopatra, Pallas, Phrygia, Elpis, no name, and no name. The Herodian dynasty's got lots of women in it. So you can see my chart. I can't probably legally put it on there, but this is, if you want to read more, it's in the living in the time of Jesus of Nazareth. And so Herod was kind of apparently women kind of come and go. And so he's going to have more sons than you can imagine, but only 4 of them they're going to become the tetrarchs. So the kingdom will be divided into 4 parts. And you probably remember that there's Herod the tetrarch that's mentioned in the Bible. That's one of his sons. So let's see, what else should we say about him? The Hasmoneans ruled before him from 140 to 63 BC. And then he's going to start about 47 and go somewhere around 0, depending on how you figure it out. So he was granted the title of King of Judea by the Roman Senate. So he had to pay taxes to them. And he was famous for getting rid of all the bandits. What makes for a good ruler? Get the crime under control. So Herod was known for doing that, and he was pretty brutal. So in the Jewish work, Jewish Antiquities, Josephus emphasizes the tyrannical authority that many scholars have come to associate with Herod's reign. He was brutal. So this whole killing of the innocents, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, makes a lot of sense. Let me just read you a little bit about him. Herod's, I love these words. They love the big words. Herod's despotic rule has been demonstrated by many of the security measures aimed at suppressing the contempt his people, especially Jews, towards him. Where have you ever heard that before? Doesn't that sound a little like China putting down anyone's opinion? So Herod worked the same way. He didn't have any opposition. So, for instance, it's been suggested that Herod used secret police to monitor and report the feelings of the general populace toward him. He sought to prohibit protests and had opponents removed by force. He had a bodyguard of 2,000 soldiers. Josephus describes various units of Herod's personal guard taking part in Herod's funeral. And then it gives actual names. If you ever read Josephus, he's a little long with words, but it does give us a lot of details of what goes on. So he rebuilt the temple, and although the outer buildings and courts continued for another 80 years after it was finished. So to comply with the religious law, Herod employed 1,000 priests as masons and carpenters in the rebuilding. And of course, we know the finished temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and it was often called the Herod's temple. And the only thing left of it is the Wailing Wall that the Jews still stand at today. Okay, we got to get some gruesome details. This is about his death. Herod died in Jericho after an excruciating, painful, petrifying illness of an uncertain cause known as posterity, as Herod's evil. Josephus states that the pain of his illness led Herod to attempt suicide by stabbing, and that the attempt was thwarted by his cousin. In some much later narratives and depictions, the attempt succeeds. For example, in the 12th century, Edwin Salter. Other medieval dramatizations, such as Ordo Rachellus, followed Josephus' account. So he came to a gruesome end from some disease and then stabs himself. Doesn't sound very good. So anyway, I could go on and on and on about Herod and how.
So how old was he then when he died?
From what I gather, in his 70s, so he actually lived a fairly long age for that time.
Yeah. And that, how,
Yeah,
he didn't have, big excavators and all of that.
exactly. So you just have to have lots of people and lots of, I don't know if he had elephants.
Bucket at a time.
Yeah, one bucket at a time.
And to make all that concrete or whatever
Yeah.
they called it, that.
Yeah, and concrete was used in that day. Roman concrete was very famous.
They had a lot
It
of
just-
slaves though, didn't they?
Yes,
it just blows your mind when you sit here and think about 1,000 here and 1,000
Yeah.
there. and-
so there's a lot of what we call working together. So that's why foremen and dictatorships, it's necessary to keep this great order. Even good companies today, you got to keep everybody working the same direction. Otherwise, you can't complete
Would
these
they have been
projects.
paid anything?
I think if they were actual, not just slaves, yes, but
Soldiers and
Yeah.
that would.
those would have been paid. But others, the slaves, probably not so much other than food and
Yeah.
Yeah.
clothing and
Place
stuff
to
like
live
that.
and-
Okay, so he's very brutal. You're kind of getting, you almost have to be to kind of take over, and he's full of himself. He's got lots of women. So he divides the kingdom after he dies into these 4 parts. We got Aristobulus, Archelaus, which we're going to hear about in our text when he takes over. Herod Antipas, which is mentioned many places in the New Testament. And then finally, Philip. And then later on in the book of Acts, we're going to hear about Herod Agrippa. And Paul's going to be taken before him. And then Herodias. You probably remember Philip's wife became the wife of Antipas. Do you remember that whole account with John the Baptist and how he preached that he shouldn't be sleeping with his brother's wife? And how Herod or John the
got him
Baptist
into
got put
trouble.
into prison. So these are all family members of Herod, but Herod's family's kind of got a history of sleeping around. I mean, if you look at this is a mess. My little chart I got on your sheet is way too simple. That's just basically the ones mentioned in the Bible. The actual Herod tree is ridiculously horrible. It's got incest, it's got people, multiple wives, it's hard to keep track. In fact, I wonder sometimes as I look at this thing, if they even know whose son is whose sometime.
Yeah.
And then of course, Herod Agrippa ends up with Herod Agrippa II, and then you've got Bernice and Drusilla that are also mentioned in Acts. And it just goes on and on and on and on. Hard to explain all of it. Okay, so we've talked about, I can get my screen to go to the next one. So Herod's more or less a Samaritan. He's a half-breed. He isn't really a Samaritan though, because to be a Samaritan, you've got to live in Samaria. And he's not there, but he's the same. That's what the Samaritans are. They're people that are half Jewish, half foreigner. Yeah, he did. But he's going to rule in kind of Jerusalem and down. So he's got all these building projects and cruel. Okay, let's look at this Massacre of the Innocents. And I've read through the years, I've read much about this. And everything that I've read is mostly guesses. The reason it's mostly guesses is because all we have is what the Bible says and that you just read. So let me give you some questions that come up. Number 1, how many babies were killed? Well, the best guess I've ever seen is, let's say Bethlehem had 1,000 or 2,000 people in it. Let's say the average age that a person would live to would be 50. Okay. So if you put 50 into 500, that's 10 times, right? So 20, 34. So you would have maybe 40, if it was a perfect world and everybody lived this 250, you would have 40 people per year, 40 babies, 41-year-olds, 42-year-olds, 43-year-olds. Do you see what I mean? But that's not the way it worked, is it? You might have a few more kids, and then they're gonna have a bunch of deaths.
That's what I was gonna say. They had a
Okay.
bunch of deaths.
Yeah, often you could lose half of those that are born. And then the 50-year-olds, there aren't gonna be as much. Now, I've read different things about that. Some estimate that there may have that Bethlehem was quite a bit smaller than what I just said. If, let's say you had, at the most, if there were, he killed everybody 2 years old and under. So if we went by that 40 number, there might have been 80.
But
Put-
you got real young soldiers going through there. They probably weren't particularly
Yeah, careful.
careful about whether the kid was 2 years old or
Yep.
4 years old.
Now, the other side of that, other scholars will argue, no, there probably wasn't 50 or 60. It may have been 2 or 3 that they murdered brutally. So we don't really know what they did, other than they came and killed those 2 years old and under. We don't know how well the soldiers obeyed. We know nothing other than that was his order. Now, if you read secular scholars, you know what they say? You know what they said. They say it didn't happen. It was all made up.
Really?
Yeah. And they said, well, it was made up based on Josephus's accounts. Herod was a brutal guy and jealous, and he was always killing. And by the way, I didn't tell you about some of the intrigue. Whenever he thought somebody was trying to take over the crown, you know what he did?
Went through a kill.
Yeah, he killed him. I mean, that's what Herod did. So they said, well, this is just made up based on all the true stories. Well, you know what's hilarious about that? It makes it make even more sense that the Bible is correct, because he was brutally jealous and didn't take any chances. There's a reason he lived almost to 70.
Don't want to take over.
Yeah, they knew they'd be put to death if they crossed him. So Herod is just an awful guy. Now, I want to tell you why Herod killed the babies, other than being jealousy. What happened in Exodus? Remember, I said that Matthew follows the exact outline of the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. What happened? Joseph was taken into Egypt, right? And then eventually all of God's people are going to end up down there because of the famine. And then they're going to be they're living in the land of Goshen, and everything's good, at least until the pharaohs forgot about Joseph. And remember, then they became under slavery. And it came to the point where God's people were growing at this astronomical level. And so Pharaoh became jealous, if you will. He felt threatened. And so what did he do? He ordered that all male babies be put to death. Okay. And remember how Moses came about? His mom.
In the little
river
folded down to a.
Yep. Put him in the basket.
Yeah.
And puts him into the river, or the reeds.
What's the key?
Yeah.
She was a high up in the ranks, the mother that took.
Yep. The daughter of Pharaoh ends up finding Moses and ends up raising and ends up finding the mother Moses' actual mother to raise him for her. And do you notice the parallel already? That just like Moses was saved in Egypt, so Jesus is going to be saved and delivered from the death of the evil ruler. So God takes care of his people. And I think we can apply that to our own life too, right? That God has spared us despite the horrors of the world and sin, and spares us just as he spared Jesus. And of course, Jesus is going to be God's instrument. We're not going to be the savior of the world like Jesus, but God will certainly use us in the midst of all of this. What about today? My next question on there is, why would Herod want Jesus dead? And why do people want God to be dead today?
Well, because one thing, God is interfering with their pleasurable way of life.
Okay, yeah.
You know, he's not in, you know, but his ideas and his rules and regulations are keeping them, or would be keeping them, from pleasure.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. He's threatening his way of life, because if Jesus is the king, is he going to be the king any longer? And the truth is, Jesus would have kept him as the king. And God can use good, godly rulers still today if they do what they're supposed to be doing, keeping law and order. Some of the things Herod did were very good. The building projects, I think, overall were good. The taking care of the crime of his day, that's good. But he didn't put God first in his life. And so he couldn't have this. Yeah. And I don't know how many of you have ever seen that movie. It came out, was it 5 or 6 years ago, down God Is Not Dead. And it's about a professor that claims Jesus is just a myth.
There's a song called that.
Yeah.
That was a good one.
Yeah, it's a good movie if you've never watched it. And it is. I like that movie because it shows how that God on one is not dead, but it's very convenient to just want God to be dead, because then you can blame the idea of God for all evil in the world. It's kind of the sacrificial lamb, kill God, and then everything will be good. What's funny is the opposite is true. God died so that all of our troubles are forgiven. It's ironic. The opposite is true. So, but yeah, I think a lot of people want nothing to do with God for a lot of reasons, whether it's pleasure, as you mentioned, Howard, or freedom to do whatever I want to do.
People don't like to be told what to do.
Yeah. Yep.
We're like kids, turning.
Yeah. No, that's true. We don't like to be told what to do. We like to do it my way. Is that a Frank Sinatra song?
Yes, it is.
My way. He's a good singer. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's keep going here. Let's turn to this town of Nazareth. So he's been in Egypt, and then the angel appears again to Joseph, and the messenger calls him out of Egypt. By the way, how did Moses get called out of Egypt?
He had an angel come to him, didn't he?
Okay, well, kind of.
A warning, it says.
Yeah, the Lord appeared in the burning bush.
Oh, yeah.
Remember?
Moses, yeah.
Yeah, with Moses, and he told him to go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go.
I thought you talked about Joseph.
Yeah. But God did lead his people through the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day. And he led them, the angel of the Lord led them
And
out of
yet
Egypt.
Their faith still faltered.
Yeah.
With all that giant
Yeah.
pillar of fire and all this stuff. And yet they still
Didn't.
Yeah, the people, yeah, they did. They faltered. They didn't follow God. Whereas Joseph, on the other hand, the angel told him he could go to back. And what did he do? He didn't falter a bit. He went right back. So this is an example of the difference between Joseph and Mary, and then with the children of Israel before them. They actually obey. And they passed the test. Do you realize God's people could have went immediately into the land of Israel? They didn't have to go for 40 years.
No.
But they
They could have had it all.
Yeah, but they wouldn't obey. They went, they thought that the people were too big, too strong, and it couldn't be done. So God takes care of Herod, and now his son is going to be born and ruling, and so it's safe to go back. Okay, so Nazareth, I guess the population today is like 76,000 people live in Nazareth, but back in Jesus' day, it's not prominent. And again, I did a bunch of reading about Nazareth ahead of Bible study today. It's not mentioned outside the Bible before 300 AD. And what that tells us, or tells scholars, is that it's not a very big town. It didn't make the maps. It's probably just a little tiny town of maybe 400 people or less.
Okay.
Although some estimated it was 2,500. But again, I don't know where they get their numbers from. But I actually like the archaeologist, or the reason they suggest it's probably 400 or smaller is because it's not mentioned. And then number two, when they've dug there, they found out they can only find one bath. And so to have a town with only one bath meant there wasn't many people there. And so that's where they get it.
I
And
bet there were a lot of towns like that,
yeah,
a lot of villages and not too many big.
yeah, I mean, Jerusalem would have been pretty big, or Jericho possibly, but I mean, this is just kind of a backwater small town. It's like James up north of
Yeah.
Sioux City, not very big, but it's there. In fact, it doesn't really make the map. Unless you're from here, then you know it's there.
No, they don't hardly have, yeah, I think they got a sign, but you can't hardly,
Yeah.
you don't notice it.
They used to have.
They used to have anyway,
When
yeah.
my husband, we tried to buy the filling station on the highway
Oh,
that in James. And they turned it into a house, but it was a filling station,
Yeah, a
and a
couple
little
people.
convenience store.
yeah.
Live in James, don't we?
Yeah, we had
Sure.
one couple from church and that,
Yep.
but yeah, and then, I don't know, somebody else got it, but my husband really wanted that, we tried to buy it.
Yeah, it's kind of a nice community. I know people that live up in there, but it's, again, what was it like? Well, I brought another book along. And I thought this was kind of helpful. This is the Biblical World Atlas by National Geographic. It's not perfect. Again, we don't know a lot about what it was like to live at those times, but there's little glimpses. So let me just read you a little bit. So the Gospels of Matthew and Luke each provide a different version of Jesus' birth. Luke states that Mary, a young woman from a town of Galilee called Nazareth, is betrothed to a man named Joseph. There's no indication of where Joseph resides, except that he descends from the house of David, thus establishing Jesus' messianic pedigree. The Gospel of John, by contrast, explicitly refers to Joseph as originating from Nazareth. So but his family, though, is from Bethlehem, or Jesus, or David's family. Okay, let me turn. Next, should it be assumed that Nazareth was a place of Jesus' birth? Well, of course not. You can hear the secular scholars saying crazy things. No, he wasn't born there. He was born in Bethlehem. Okay, so it says, and again, we don't know exactly about all of this, but Mary is a young girl. She was probably simple clothes, linen undergarment covered by a long sleeveless tunic, bound by two girdles, one under the bosom and one around the waist. When going out, invariably in the company of a mother or another female relative, a girl covered her shoulders with a long rectangular cloak, and her hair with a veil. These cloaks were often adorned with simple geometric patterns near the shoulders and on the hem. Fragments of human hair found in En-Gedi suggest the girls braided their hair and used two-faced combs, similar to one found by excavators in the mountain fortress of Masada for styling. And in fact, I don't know if you can see this, but they've got a picture of one they found. It's right at the bottom there. So it looks kind of like a modern comb. It's got thick part and a thin part as well. So apparently they groomed a little bit like they do today. So it says Jesus' youth in Nazareth, although the location of Jesus' birth, oh, this is stupid. He's born in Bethlehem, idiots. We believe in the Bible. So you can see how much National Geographic believes their Bible. So it says, let me go on. Now I'm getting mad at it again. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus speaks with evident authority about the difficulty of sowing. So you can, again, we can get the idea how they did things. The sower went out to sow. As he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil, and when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Casting practiced eye on the fig tree that had not borne fruit 3 years. Jesus counsels the owner to let it alone for 1 more year until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit the next year, well and good, but if not, you can cut it down. I think the point they're making is good. What was it like to live at that time? It was hard work. You were out sowing, and probably everybody was doing that to some extent. And notice
I
they're,
think they work from daylight to
yeah,
sunset, didn't they?
I believe so. So they're going to be working all the time. They're going to be going, Jesus, what I've read is gone, probably went to synagogue school as early as 5 to 6 years old and would have learned under the local rabbi, but also being trained in his home with his parents as well.
Or didn't he grow up to be a kind of a carpenter? with his
Yep,
dad?
Joseph is mentioned to be a carpenter. And so, which that would have probably meant not so much that he worked with wood, but with stone, because almost everything was made out of stone at that time. So, but it's maybe a little bit closer to our world for builder.
They could have used our union.
Yeah, our unions from Sioux City. There you go. So you kind of get the idea. There would have been art and other things at that time. Let's see. There is a comment here, and I think this is accurate. Joseph's household was growing. According to Mark and Matthew, Jesus had 4 younger brothers and an unspecified number of sisters. So several scholars suggest that Joseph and his eldest son may have worked at Antipas's reconstruction of Sepphoris for much of Jesus' teenage years and well into early adulthood. In fact, the true meaning of Greek word tekton, and I've mentioned this already, carpenter, can mean more like laborer or worker, or for that matter, stone worker. So he may have worked at that time.
Well, one of his brothers wrote a book.
Yeah.
James. I
Yep,
think.
James, his brother, wrote
Yeah.
the book of James.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it could have been, this is kind of interesting. This is historical fact. If he had worked on that Roman project of that day, it says there was even a sophisticated sewage system underneath the stone pavement. In addition, Antipas indulged in the building of expensive Roman theater, similar to the famous amphitheater of Jerusalem built by his father. Sepphoris, writes Josephus, was the jewel of Galilee. The construction of Sepphoris took many years, and the project must have dominated commercial activity in Galilee, consumed consumable amounts of manpower, supplies, foodstuffs from all over the region throughout Jesus' adolescence. It's difficult to imagine that such a nearby undertaking would have left the family of Jesus unaffected. Sepphoris was barely 5 miles from Nazareth. So being that close, it does make sense. For a farmer without land, tools, draft animals, and seeds, the booming construction activity would have presented a fortuitous opportunity to earn a living and sustain a growing family. Which is interesting to think about. That was all going on right nearby to Nazareth. So he's growing up there, but he's learning his faith, growing in life. He's also the Son of God at the same time. Let's not forget that. So he knows all this, but he's submissive to his father and mother. So there is a number of references in the New Testament to Jesus using words about building. Build your house on the rock, not on the sand. So Jesus, the people of that day understood these big building projects. They understood that if you build on sand, it could be coming down. And we're going to run into that in just a few minutes, or not today, but as we get to the Sermon on the Mount. So we sometimes picture that it's a very unsophisticated time, but it isn't. They're building, they're farming, they're cities, they're small towns. I mean, they wear clothes. I mean, it's not like some, yeah. But any questions on all that? I hope it kind of gives you an idea. Jesus came down from heaven. He became one of us. So he understands what we go through.
Well, see, that's what I think. He came down and then became one of us because he wanted to understand exactly how we went through things and stuff.
And death would have been prominent at that time as well. People died. There were sicknesses and troubles. He wasn't doing miracles until the one where Mary told him to
Just do it.
just deal with that water.
Just do
Get-
it.
So-
He followed his mom.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting what he was up to in Nazareth. Again, we don't know a lot other than he grew up there and he was fully man, and
He
don't
grew-
forget that.
He grew up in a family. He
Yeah.
had brothers and sisters, and just like we have brothers and
Mhm.
sisters, and growing up in a home and taking care of.
Yeah. And I know it,
normal things.
and I don't mean to make Jesus less than he is, because we get both. He's 100% God, but he's also 100% man. So
He
he went,
understands us.
I
Yeah.
often wonder about that when he's a kid. Did he get in fights?
So,
probably not.
Probably.
The question is, did Jesus get into fights? And I says,
You know how siblings are. They are.
yeah.
yeah,
Did he have
Did he get
fun?
picked on, is what you're asking.
Uh,
Did he get picked on?
well, just a fight, just a disagreement.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, anything he did would be without sin, though. That's
Yeah.
even as it's hard for us to understand, because
Yeah.
kids just naturally fight and get
Oh,
into
yeah.
trouble. And,
Yeah,
but he was perfect in every way.
yeah.
So he's listening to his parents. So I think we're going to stop right there. We'll pick up next time with the start of his ministry. And I know there's not a lot of details between this being born in Nazareth. He's going to go to the temple a few times, according to the requirements of the law. But really, we're going to pick up with John the Baptist next. And he's going to be 30 years old and begin his ministry. Well, let's stop. We'll close with a prayer. Lord, thank you for being just like us, to be human and live a life, except that you followed the pattern of Israel and went to Egypt and returned, except in your case, without sin. Lord, help us to follow in your stead and know that you take care of us through our Egypts and bringing us back to the promised land. Keep us strong to the end, for the sake of your Son, Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen.